From our earliest days, we are taught the sacred commandments of a good character. The lesson is delivered in 1,000 different forms, from the fables we are read as children to the unspoken rules of our adult society. Be kind, be humble, be selfless. Do not be proud or boastful, for pride comes before the fall. Find your strength in gentleness, your power in forgiveness. Turn the other cheek when you are struck. The meek, we are told, shall inherit the earth. This is the moral blueprint for a virtuous life. We are taught to admire the person who absorbs an insult with a patient smile, who celebrates the success of others more than their own, and who places the needs of the herd far above their own selfish desires. This gentle, self-sacrificing individual is held up as the pinnacle of human development, the very definition of a good person. We are taught to admire this person, to praise them, and to strive in our own flawed ways to be them. This is the virtue of the Lamb. But what if, just for a moment, we were to look at this entire moral framework from a different and far more ruthless perspective? Not from the ground, amidst the flock, but from the cold, clear, and unforgiving air, from the perspective of an eagle. From this high vantage point, how do these cherished virtues appear? Humility can begin to look like a profound fear of one's own power. Selflessness can look like an inability to assert one's own value. The celebrated act of turning the other cheek can look suspiciously like simple cowardice. The eagle, looking down, might ask a series of unsettling questions. Is the lamb truly more virtuous than I am? Or is it simply that the lamb has no claws? Is its gentleness a moral choice or merely a biological necessity? And is it possible that the lamb, in its powerlessness, has come to despise the very nature of my strength and has, in a brilliant act of self-preservation, rebranded its fear as goodness and my power as evil? This dangerous line of questioning is the entry point into one of the most explosive, controversial, and potentially liberating ideas in the entire history of philosophy. It is an idea that, once understood, threatens to turn your entire conception of morality upside down. It comes from the philosopher who was perhaps the most courageous and uncompromising psychologist to have ever lived, Friedrich Nietzsche. He looked at the grand cathedral of our modern moral values, and he saw not a divinely inspired structure, but a human, all too human invention. He saw a prison, and he put forth a shocking and world-shattering hypothesis. He argued that our entire modern conception of goodness, our praise of humility, of pity, of meekness, is not a sign of humanity's spiritual evolution. Instead, he claimed it was a sophisticated psychological weapon, a form of spiritual revenge, invented thousands of years ago by the weak, the oppressed, and the powerless, in order to poison the conscience and pull down the strong. He called it the slave revolt in morality. We will call it the Great Inversion, the single brilliant and terrifying historical moment when the values of the victim were successfully rebranded as the highest virtue, and the values of the strong were condemned as the ultimate sin. And it forces us to ask the most uncomfortable question of all. What if everything you've been taught about being a good person is actually a psychological trap designed to make you weaker? To understand the Great Inversion, we must become, as Nietzsche did, genealogists of our own morals. A genealogist is a historian, not of battles and kings, but of values themselves. Nietzsche dared to ask the most dangerous questions. Where did our modern concepts of good and evil actually come from? Are they eternal, divine truths handed down from on high? Or are they something far more human? Are they perhaps weapons forged in the fires of a great, ancient, and almost completely hidden psychological war? His investigation, laid out in his masterwork on the genealogy of morality, revealed that there was not one, but two fundamentally different origins for the concept of good. First, there was what he called master morality. This was the original value system of the ancient world, created by the noble, the powerful, and the aristocratic castes. Think of the heroes of the Homeric epics, the patricians of Rome, the Viking chieftains. Their morality was not born from a complex system of rules or from a sacred text. It was born from a spontaneous and joyous act of self-affirmation. They looked at themselves, at their own strength, their health, their courage, their pride, their power to shape the world, and they said, "This is good." For the noble soul, the concept of good was synonymous with the concept of noble. It was a celebration of a triumphant, overflowing, and life-affirming existence. And what was bad? Bad was simply an afterthought. It was a dismissive term they used to describe the common, the weak, the sickly, the timid. The eagle does not hate the lamb. It simply perceives it as other, as lesser. This master morality, crucially, is born from a position of strength and abundance. But every society has its masters and its subjects. And for every powerful noble, there were thousands of the weak, the oppressed, the sickly, the enslaved. These people were powerless to compete with the masters on the physical battlefield. So, Nietzsche argues, they began a different, more subtle, and far more cunning kind of war, a war of values. And this war was fueled by the most potent and poisonous of human emotions, what he called resentment. Resentment is not just resentment. It is a deep, festering, and creative hatred of an external enemy. It is the bitterness of the powerless, who, unable to act in the world, are forced to concoct an imaginary revenge in their own minds. Because they could not say a triumphant yes to their own lives, their entire system of morality was born from a spiteful no to the lives of their masters. Slave morality, from its very inception, is a reaction. It needs an external, evil enemy to define itself. And this is where the brilliant, world-altering event occurs. This is the slave revolt in morality. Led by what Nietzsche called a priestly caste, clever, intellectual, and deeply filled with resentment, the slaves performed the most profound act of spiritual revenge in human history. They inverted the master's values. They took all the qualities of the noble, their pride, their ambition, their power, their wealth, their joy in their own strength, and they declared these things to be the ultimate evil. The proud man was now guilty of the sin of pride. The powerful man was an oppressor. The assertive man was cruel. Then they performed the second, even more ingenious part of the trick. They took all the attributes of their own weakness, all the consequences of their own oppression, and they rebranded them as virtues. Their inability to fight back was rebranded as the virtue of patience. Their meekness was rebranded as humility. Their submission was rebranded as obedience. And most brilliantly of all, their suffering was declared to be a sign of moral purity. "Blessed are the meek," they whispered, "for they shall inherit the earth." For Nietzsche, this was the moment that the psychological poison was released into the bloodstream of humanity. It was the moment that weakness was declared to be a choice, and a virtuous one at that. It was the moment the lambs finally convinced the world, and even the eagles themselves, that being a lamb was morally superior to being an eagle. It is a difficult and dizzying thing to see the world through Nietzsche's eyes. It becomes even more difficult when you find the courage to turn that unforgiving gaze upon yourself. For a very long time, I was a good and faithful soldier in the army of slave morality. I had completely internalized the virtues of the lamb. My sense of self-worth was inextricably tied to being perceived by others as a nice person, and I was very, very good at playing that part. I was the person who never raised his voice. I was the master of the agreeable nod. I was the one who would always offer to help, who would always stay late, who would always swallow his own opinion to preserve a comfortable harmony. I felt a deep, reflexive guilt at the slightest hint of my own pride, at the faintest flicker of my own selfish desires. I believed with all my heart that this was the path to a virtuous and well-lived life. In my professional life, this manifested as a kind of terminal reliability. I was the one who would quietly take on the extra work without complaint, who would clean up the messes of less competent colleagues, who would work tirelessly behind the scenes to make a project a success. I had good ideas, but I would present them timidly, always framing them as a group effort, terrified of appearing arrogant. The result was predictable. I was well liked. I was seen as a team player, and I was consistently and repeatedly passed over for positions of leadership. My carefully cultivated humility, was not interpreted as a sign of a noble character. It was correctly interpreted as a lack of ambition, as a lack of the necessary ruthlessness to lead. My goodness was, in a very practical sense, a form of weakness. In my personal relationships, this tyranny of being nice was even more insidious. I became a professional peacekeeper. I saw conflict not as a necessary tool for growth and honesty, but as a catastrophic failure. And so I avoided it at all costs. I would swallow my own needs, my own frustrations, my own desires, all for the sake of maintaining a fragile and ultimately dishonest peace. I would agree to things I did not want to do, simply to be agreeable. I became a perfect mirror for the needs and desires of others, and in the process, my own reflection began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, disappear. But the most poisonous part of this existence was not the external consequences. It was what was happening on the inside. This constant self-denial, this relentless suppression of my own will, did not lead to a state of saintly peace. It led to the slow and steady accumulation of the very thing Nietzsche diagnosed: resentment. A quiet, bitter, and deeply shameful resentment began to grow in the basement of my soul. A resentment toward the colleagues who unapologetically pursued their own ambition and succeeded. A resentment toward the friends who took my kindness for granted. This bitterness was my dirtiest secret because it completely contradicted the nice guy persona I worked so hard to maintain. So it festered in the dark, expressing itself in the classic passive-aggressive symptoms of slave morality, in gossip, in cynical commentary, and in the secret, satisfying pleasure I would feel when one of my more powerful rivals would fail. The turning point was the slow, dawning, and deeply painful realization that my goodness was a sham. It was not a sign of a strong and overflowing spirit. It was a strategy, a defense mechanism, born from a profound and deep-seated weakness. And I finally had to confess the truth to myself. My niceness was not a virtue, it was a form of fear. It was the fear of confrontation. It was the fear of being disliked. It was the fear that if I were to ever truly show my own ambition, my own power, my own unapologetic will, the world would find me monstrous and cast me out. I was not a good man. I was a tame one. And for most of my life, I had mistaken the bars of my cage for a halo. To recognize that your own goodness may be a cage is a terrifying and disorienting moment. The path forward is not a simple one. It requires a quiet but relentless rebellion against your own deepest programming and against the expectations of the world around you. This is not a guide to becoming evil in the simplistic sense. It is a guide to transcending the herd's definition of good and evil altogether, and to creating a stronger, more honest, and more life-affirming mode of existence. The first practice is to become a genealogist of your own morals. You must put your own virtues on trial. For every moral value that you hold dear, for every quality that makes you a good person, you must have the courage to perform a ruthless interrogation. You must ask the uncomfortable question: from where does this value truly spring? Does it come from a place of strength and abundance, or from a place of weakness, fear, and resentment? Take your humility, for example. Is your humility a genuine and joyful recognition of your small place in a vast cosmos? Or is it a deep-seated fear of taking up space, a terror of being seen as arrogant, a clever strategy to make yourself small so that others will not attack you? Take your compassion. Is it an overflowing of your own strength, a genuine desire to elevate another person? Or is it what Nietzsche called pity, a way to feel momentarily superior to the sufferer, a way to indulge in a sad emotion without taking any real constructive action? And your kindness. Is your kindness a conscious choice, born from a position of power, the choice of a person who could cause harm but actively chooses not to? Or is it simply a lack of assertiveness, a deep-seated fear of the consequences of saying no? This unflinching self-interrogation is the first step to understanding which of your virtues are authentic and which are just your most beautiful and well-disguised fears. The second path is to consciously practice a new spiritual nobility. If the values of the herd are born from weakness, The antidote is to intentionally cultivate the virtues of the noble soul within yourself. This has nothing to do with wealth or lineage. It has to do with your orientation to the world. First, practice pride. In a culture that relentlessly preaches humility, you must learn to take a quiet, profound, and unapologetic pride in your own accomplishments, your own strengths, and your own character. Acknowledge your own value to yourself without shame. Second, practice generosity from a place of abundance. The morality of pity gives because it wants to alleviate its own discomfort at the sight of suffering. The noble soul gives because it has a surplus of strength, of joy, of life. Practice giving your time, your knowledge, and your resources not as a sad duty to the less fortunate, but as a joyful expression of your own overflowing power. Finally, learn to value excellence over equality. The herd is comfortable in mediocrity. The noble soul is inspired by greatness. Seek out and admire people who are stronger, smarter, and more virtuous than you. Learn from them, celebrate them, and resist the poisonous whisper of resentment that would have you tear them down. This leads to the final and most creative act of this rebellion. You must create your own table of values. Once you have questioned the old morality and practiced the new nobility, you must have the courage to become a lawgiver to yourself. The practice is to sit down in solitude and to consciously decide what, for you, is the highest good. What is worth dedicating your life to? What is worth suffering for? Is it truth, beauty, strength, wisdom, joy, creation? You must write down your own commandments, a new moral code that is not designed for the comfort of the herd, but for the elevation and the self-overcoming of your own spirit. This table of values becomes your personal law, the standard against which you alone will measure yourself. And in doing so, you take a monumental step beyond good and evil. You are no longer a slave to the values of others. You have become the creator of your own. We began this journey with the familiar and comforting image of the Lamb, the gentle creature whose meekness and self-sacrifice have been praised as the pinnacle of moral virtue for 2,000 years. We can now finally see it through Nietzsche's unforgiving eyes. We see it not as a symbol of divine goodness, but as the brilliant and tragic emblem of a successful historical rebellion, a spiritual revenge that convinced the world that weakness was strength, that fear was virtue, and that the inability to cause harm was the same as being good. The Great Inversion was not just a single event that happened in the distant past. It is a personal choice that is presented to us every single day, in every interaction, in every moral decision we make. We are all born into a world that has already been shaped by this slave morality. Its values are in the air we breathe. The choice before us is a difficult and dangerous one. We can continue to live by the morality of the herd, a value system that offers safety, comfort, and social acceptance. The price for this comfort is your own power, your own individuality, and your own potential for greatness. It is the path of being a good and well-behaved member of the flock. Or we can choose the other path, the difficult, lonely, and often terrifying path of self-creation. A path that requires you to become your own judge, your own lawgiver, and the creator of your own values. It is a path that will almost certainly bring you into conflict with the comfortable consensus of the world. Nietzsche never promised that this path would lead to happiness, but it is the only path that leads to a life that is truly, unapologetically your own. It is the choice to be an eagle, even if it means flying alone rather than a comfortable and well-fed lamb. This is perhaps Nietzsche's most dangerous idea, and to even consider it seriously is an act of rebellion. If you are ready to continue questioning everything you have been taught about morality, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. And now, you must begin your own genealogy. Share your first thought in the comments below. What is one good quality that you now suspect might be a form of weakness holding you back? Your answer is the first step on the path beyond good and evil.